Hello, Jeando.
Hello, Kevin. Hi.
Hi. In our last video, we talked about conscious control, and in it you mentioned that people can't control themselves, can't control their movements correctly if they trust to what feels right. Why
Yes.
can't they trust to what feels right, and how does this relate to conscious control?
Yes, that's a very good question. Well, I discovered that for myself that if you want to organize the mechanism of the torso, you have to deal with several movements happening at the same time. It's called coordination. Alexander calls it concerted activity. It's like there is a director, and the director has to, in fact, instruct different parts of an orchestra so that all the parts are working together to the same aim. And that's where the problem is, really, about the difference that there is between reasoned activity and sensor and somatic activity, is that it's impossible to feel four things going on at the same time. You can feel an overall impression of what it is you're doing when you're, for example, leaning forward with the torso. But once you watch yourself doing that on a film with a graphical method to analyze the different movements you're making with the parts, you suddenly discover that there is a very, very wide discrepancy between this general synthesis of feelings and the movements that are really happening on screen. That's a definite moment, and that's why giving lessons that are recorded is so important. Is that most people say watching themselves performing a movement according to very clear specification. They say, no, I did not do that. I was not doing that at all. Well, we have to reckon that there is a discrepancy, there is a difference between what they felt they were doing. So their thinking about what they were doing was based on what they felt at the moment.
Can you give us a specific example of something where someone was doing one thing, but they were convinced that they were doing something else, the opposite?
Yes, yes. For example, in leaning forward, there is, of course, you have to deal with the movements of the lower part of the torso, of the pelvis. And so the person has the impression that because she's been ordered to slow down the movement of the top, the front part of the pelvis forward, and to, in fact, accelerate the lower part, which is the sitting bones, forward toward the plane that is imaginary. And the person has the impression that he's really rotating in this way. And in fact, on screen, she's not. Or something even more simple. You ask a person to think about the top of the mechanism of the torso at the front. For example, you ask the person to touch the top of the sternum. Say, well, that is the top of the sternum. Let's give it a name so that we can remember it quickly and direct our mind to it easily. So we say, well, we are going to call that throat spot. Okay, and then you ask them to feel the center of their torso, and you ask them, well, can you feel the arch of the ribs? Can you see that there is a rib protruding very, very much forward? So, for example, you ask them, could you suck your belly in? And you will find that this arch at one moment has what we call a point of inflection, because the arch is really a curve. And when you look at the curve with the belly really drawn in, you will find that there is one moment, very an anatomical or geometrical point of interest is that at one moment that curve is changing direction, as it's suddenly going, instead of following the same axis on the front of the torso, it's going very fast backwards. So there is a sharp bend. So you notice that bend? Yes. Could you stick your finger on it? Yes. Oh, yes, you can. There are two on one on each side, so it's easy to imagine a line between the two. So now we have the rib 8 spots, which is the rib. We create the rib 8 line I just exposed, and you say, okay, you've got that line, and you got that spot at the top we call throat. Okay, you're going, for example, in leaning forward to order yourself to accelerate the movement of the throat and, in fact, reduce the movement of the rib line. The person says, fine. And you ask the person counting to 3 to start at 1, finish at 3, and do the leaning movement with an acceleration of the spot that is at the top and a deceleration of the line that you were mentioning in the center of the torso. And the person leans forward and as orders herself to really accelerate the middle of the top of the torso and decelerate the middle. And when you look at the picture, you find that the person has not done so. And the person looks at her own screen and looks at herself and says, "But I was, I was giving consent to these orders. They don't appear on screen. It's appear that I'm always accelerating the middle and slowing down the top, which explains the shortening of the top of the back." And so the person will say, but in order to achieve what you're saying on screen, I would need to feel really, really strange and constraining my torso. I'll say, yes, that's the idea. Uh, your habitual feeling of moving the torso in space to lean has created a habit of concerted movements. If you do change the concerted movements, if you reason that it's necessary to lengthen the back, and so to lengthen the back, we have just reasoned out that it was necessary to change the speed of the relative speed of the spots. So then, yes, you must accept to feel absolutely wrong in order to see the new adjustment appear on video. And the person will then start a new experiment again. So this time with the idea of distrusting the sensory appreciation from the word go, because that commitment had not been made last time. Last time was just an order. I accelerate the top of the torso, I decelerate the middle of the torso, and the person thought that what she would feel during the practical experiment would help her to achieve the new adjustment. In fact, it did not. So the person is then going to think, okay, I am really going to slow down, like to a stop the middle torso and accelerate the top of the torso and feel wrong as a result. And so when the person looks at the new experiment on video, a new realization comes to the person. The person says, oh, yes, I'm starting to see the back lengthening, but very little. So that means that I should feel even more wrong in order to lengthen the torso completely. I say, well, yeah, it seems like it, yeah. At the moment, you have to dare going wrong. You're not daring enough. You are trying to still feel as habitual, as normal, when in fact, in order to change the concerted activity of the two movements, apparently, yes, you need to make a new experiment and also, well, increase your detachment from what feels right to you. I don't know what feels right to you. I can see only what the movements you're doing, and the moment your movements are really limited. Another experiment that Alexander was fond of is retraced, explained by one of his pupils in 1918. And he says that you're first shown your incapacity to, in fact, disconnect movement to for example, very simple example is that you ask a person to move one spot and to inhibit the movement of another one on the same mechanism of the torso. So you take the top of the mechanism of the torso, you take the front of the bottom of the mechanism of the torso, so throat at the top, and you ask the person to touch the front of the bone of the pelvis. And you tell the person, you are going to move the throat forward, yes, but you're going to tell yourself, no, I am not moving the iliac, the front of the anterior superior iliac crest that you have explained where to find to the person. You say, you're not going to move that part. Do you understand the orders? And the person says, yes, I do not move the front of the bottom of the torso. I say, do you need to touch to tell yourself that? Why is it that you are touching the part? You're making a feeling, and are you not going to try and follow that feeling? No, I want you to just imagine and what we call a model, a representation. Can you have a representation of the two spots on the same system, on the same mechanism? You have the front of the bottom of the torso, the top of the torso, and when you're going to move the top of the torso, you want to, well, give an order not to move the lower part of the torso. And the person says, fine, I understand, I will do that. Person counts to 3, starts at 1, start the movement, and stop. And we watch the film. Curiously, the person has not stopped moving the iliac, the lower part of the torso, when moving the upper part of the torso. The two movements are intertwined, they are linked, they are not independent. So the person has a very marked difficulty disassociating movements. The coordination of the movements of the parts of the torso is already installed. It's already there. So the person does not feel she is doing the movement of the iliac first and the throat second when she's asked to move the throat and not the iliac. So we would say that her sensory appreciation of the coordinated movements and so it's also the interdependence of the movements is not registered in her feelings. Many people think that after being re-educated, they can feel these things. They can feel these different movements and that their coordinated activity is improved. It's the case. It was my case when I finished my training, and it remained true until I started to do graphical analysis with videos. I started to see, in fact, that what I thought my sensory appreciation had been reeducated through the somatic modern Alexander technique 3 years training course, having lessons every single day and even lessons with teacher and visiting other schools and everything. And when I started to watch myself on video in controlled experiment with graphical tools, I discovered that no. So that is why we do say that sensory appreciation is untrustworthy to change or readjust a coordinated activity. So as we are teaching coordinated activities through conscious guidance and conscious control, for us, we do not trust sensory appreciation. What we feel we are doing is immensely wrong. So that is the point.
So the right thing, because someone's done something so many times, it's become familiar and it just feels right to them. So because it
Yes.
feels right, they assume it's right.
Yeah.
So, but then if they're going to do something different because it's unfamiliar, even though it might be right uh, based on an objective standard according to the model we're aiming at, it's going to feel wrong to them because it's unfamiliar.
Yes. We always, in fact, discover new activities in which what felt right the day before is going to be uh, discarded. We have to discard the past experience in order to create a new experience. So that's why Alexander said that inhibition is in the center of this technique. We have to inhibit or trust to feeling time and time again. So um, when we consider conscious guidance and control, we are considering directing ourselves with reason. Um, it may be necessary to explain what we mean by directing oneself with reason. And in order to do that, I want to, in fact, show you a few pictures that are going to, in fact, make much clearer. Or otherwise, my discourse is going to sound very, very theoretical. And so let's start with, first of all, uh, one idea that is central, that is that there is a necessity of lengthening and widening the mechanism of the torso. Yes. So in order to start, here it is. We are looking at the moment at three different pictures of an elderly gentleman. Well, he's really elderly on the first picture, and this gentleman is Frederick Matthias Alexander, the founder of what he called the Alexander technique. And so when we observe the three different pictures, there is something that is really striking, is that his way of using the mechanism of the torso is not natural. There is something quite strange. And you can translate not natural because by a very simple experiment, you just try to imitate the attitude of the torso as this elderly gentleman is presenting here. And in order to do that, you have to yourself manipulate the different movements of the parts and film yourself. And then you compare the gesture you have produced and the gesture you see here. And so there is something very strange in his gesture, is that, well, at first I didn't know exactly what it is. Um, and there is a part of the back that is very flat, and there is a part of the back that is very rounded forward. You cannot imagine that this is a habit of his, um, that is his way. Yes, this is a somatic or an embodied cognition. You cannot, because you see that he's able to maintain the same angle and the same organization in very, very different attitudes. Yeah, yeah. I just point that in this, for example, the central image, we can see that he's bending one leg and extending the other. And still, the mechanism of the torso is still organized in the same way. I have asked many of my students to, in fact, play at imitating that gesture. And systematically, we have found that when we were practicing this, what was happening is that one side of the pelvis was higher than the other. And as a result, there was a sharp curve at the back. This gentleman is able not to do that, so that he's compensating for the very strange adjustments of the legs, of the bones of the legs, to organize the torso exactly in the same way. And when you look at him doing the frog dance, which is we call nowadays squat, you will find that very curiously, um, well, here it's only a picture, of course, but we have a film where Alexander is making a squat. And from that film, even if it's not exactly sagittal, of a sagittal view, a view from the side, it's clear that when he's squatting, going down, um, the axis of the torso is exactly similar at each phases of going down, from what we call the leaning mechanical advantage position right down to here. So when you film yourself doing that, well, you see, it's an impossible equilibrium. So from that, um, you have to, in fact, deduce that this is a learned coordination of the movement of the different parts of the torso. So you see that there is this sharp bend at the top, and I could not explain that to myself because in my modern Alexander technique teaching, this very strange organization of the top of the torso relative to the middle of the torso has totally been eradicated. Nobody nowadays uses this. And so I started to wonder, and so when you start to wonder, you start to try and see and find other evidence. And then there is another evidence, is that Alexander is in fact organizing his torso in this way, but also when he works with somebody, well, this image is not very good, but because it's taken out of the film, the only film we have of the elderly gentleman that is at the back, we can't see him here, but it's Alexander, FM Alexander, that is at the back. And all during the whole lesson, he is organizing the different parts of the torso in order to create what was called at the time the hump. It's the sharp curve at the top and the very, very flat lengthening back between the middle and lower part of the torso. So, wow, you think this is clearly something that you could relate to the idea of lengthening and widening the torso. What do we mean by these words? So that was one evidence. The other evidence was that that tended to prove that Alexander was really adamant on creating that type of coordination is when you look, of course, at him. Again, here it is. But you've got also a few of his first disciples, the first teachers of the modern Alexander technique. You have Charles Trevelyan, and Charles Trevelyan, when he bends, it's absolutely clear that once again you find the same organization of the movements of the parts of the torso. I am absolutely clear that we are talking about movements because, well, of course, this is leaning forward and leaning forward quite far down. And in order to keep that organization, you need to, in fact, mentally manipulate the movement of the lower part of the torso, the pelvis, the middle torso, and the upper torso as well. This is Charles Neal. Um, this is from a film in 1955, just after the death of Alexander, and he's mowing the grass. He's making a film to demonstrate the use of the Alexander technique in usual activities. And so we see once again the exact same organization of the different parts of the torso, with the upper torso very far forward. And from the armpit, there is that straight back, meaning that there is a definite organization between the middle and lower part of the torso. Well, and finally, I also wanted to show Mr. Patrick McDonald. And when you see Mr. Patrick McDonald working, is working with a pupil, but also is working, of course, with himself. And when he works with himself, well, once again, we saw the same pattern, which was not the pattern I was used to because in nearly 8 years that followed the death of the founder, suddenly the Alexander technique was changed. Well, the meaning of lengthening the back was changed. Mr. MacDonald had a strong influence in the new modern Alexander technique. And I will show you next time a video where we see him organize the different parts of the movements, different movements of the parts of the torso and head. And it's very, very interesting to compare what he is doing with what the founder is seen doing in his video. So I was more, this is just Mr. Murray performing the, what he called the monkey, and teaching a pupil. And then what we, but I have nothing against Mr. Murray. I like his books. I'm very fond of his written work. And but this is not special to Mr. Murray. This is the whole modern Alexander technique. And we see that the organization of the part of the torso is completely different. The meaning of lengthening the back has totally changed. There is a new system, and we see that very particularly the upper torso is very, very far back. So in 10 years' time, a complete change in the center of the system of gestural adjustment has been transformed. So who are we to follow? Who are we to believe? So I started to to think that how could Alexander, in fact, create that shape? And as I told you, I found that very quickly that he said he was a Delsart teacher when he started to open his teaching room in 1896. And so of course I went and started to read everything I could about the Delsart system, the gestural part of the Delsart system. And I found something there that was very, very similar to what we think in the Alexander technique. They didn't say lengthening and widening the torso. They had another expression. This was the harmonic expansion of the torso. It was all the center of the gestural system was based on the harmonic expansion of the torso. And the idea was, in fact, not invented by Mr. Delsart. He had found the criterion in the Greek sculpture. So, Greek sculpture, how can you find anything in Greek sculpture? What would you find? So first of all, you find an attitude of the torso that is very strange. And in this attitude of the torso, you will find the spots I was talking about. So for example, when we decide to organize and our activity through reason orders, we need to have a basis for reasoning. And we know one thing is for sure, is that when you move, when you concert orders of movements, the muscles, the flesh changes shape and changes length. It can shorten and lengthen. So it's very, very difficult. Well, it's impossible to, in fact, reason out a system that is changing all the time. It's much easier, of course, to reason with rigid structure, because the spot of the top of the sternum is not going to change after being moved either forward or backward. And so here we see what we call the mechanism of the torso. And I have reproduced on the mechanism of the torso the different spots I was talking about: the top of the sternum, the throat, and the very sharp bend on the front of the torso is the same for everybody: men, women, children, the same thing. It's always the eighth rib. And the eighth rib is very interesting because it's connected with the center of the thoracic curve at the back. The eighth rib goes right back to connect with the vertebrae, and it connects at the point where we have what we call the primary thoracic curve. Then The pelvis is the lower part of the torso, and we see at the front the anterior superior iliac crest that we call iliac, another bony spot, and finally the sitting bones. So what is interesting in this representation of the charioteer is that there is a geometric orientation. Mr. Delsart found a criterion for the harmonic expansion of the torso. The criterion is very simple. We see that the spots at the front of the torso are aligned on the same plane. Fine, this is reasonable. This is easy to evaluate. So that's what I immediately started to think about, to think, okay, conscious control. If you want to consciously control something, you need to have a criterion. You need to have a model that will help you to make sense of what you see. And then I started a very simple experiment. I said, let's take exactly the same spots as we've seen before, and we say, I'm going to reproduce the statue. I am going, in fact, to try and organize the movements of the different parts of the torso so that I get the harmonic expansion of the torso that Delsart was talking about. And then I get a very clear result. And surprisingly, I see immediately that the clear result I am seeing here is Alexander lengthening of the mechanism of the torso. We see the straight line between the lower and middle part of the torso, and right at the armpit height, we see a marked hump. It's very interesting. So you think, wow, he may have been, Alexander, I mean, may have been a Delsart teacher after all. Most people think, well, most teachers think that he was not, that he invented himself as a Delsart teacher. But wow, when you see this evidence, when I saw it, I say, well, wow, it's a bit more complex than this. It's just, he maybe didn't lie. Yes, Alexander maybe didn't lie about his knowledge of the Delsart system, because at least he knew exactly how to, in fact, promote, because this is a control. You see, we are controlling that the spots are at the correct distance from the vertical plane. But it's another thing to just guide that organization of the movement of the parts. It's like, how could you create the movement at the different height in order that when you come and measure against the wall, you get exactly that geometrical expansion of the torso. And this is a bit simplistic because, in fact, I quickly found that just aligning the spots on the same plane was not sufficient to, in fact, observe the quality of attitude that Alexander was presenting. There is something missing here, is that, yes, you need to have the three spots on the same plane, but you need also to find a way to expand that line. The harmonic expansion needs you to find a way not only to align the three spots at the front of the torso, three spots in from the side, but also to find a way to lift, well, the middle and upper torso away from the lower torso. So that's another story. But from that, you get an idea that now we have a reasoned way to, in fact, develop our capacity of coordinated activity with the different movements. Because when you start to, well, learn this conscious guidance and control system of your own movements, well, you discover that, well, you are very, very far. Your habitual coordination is very, very far from showing this. When you're sitting, when you're standing, when you're leaning forward, backward, when you're walking or running. So, conscious guidance and control is based on reasoning, is based on something Alexander called being in communication with reason. To be in communication with reason, you need a model. So here we have an expression of a simplistic model, but it's a good start. And then we can create descriptions and we can create orders of movements that are valid. There is a difference between thinking let the back lengthen and widen, which is a result, which is an end, and what are the means whereby movements which will allow us to show on video that we are able to direct and project effectively these movements. There is two questions here. One question is, of course, to be able to think the model, to be able to uh, realize which order could, in fact, implement the new harmonic expansion of the torso. But there is another, that is only the start. There is another, is then to check whether in practice you can obey these orders or not. The whole construction of the discipline is there. The discipline understood as a capacity to train oneself to act according to instructions, according to orders, according to rules, how to mix different rules together, and also discipline in the sense of, well, creating an activity that is according to principle. So, being in communication with reason. Yeah, sorry.
And to get into this position, this adjustment you have on the right hand side here is going to feel extremely wrong to someone when they do it. It's not going to feel, they're not going to feel right. Oh, I've achieved the model. This feels right now. It's going to feel wrong to them in the moment. And then we control it by watching the video or the image to see after what actually happened.
Yes, exactly. It's going to feel immensely wrong for a simple reason, is that in our habitual way of sitting, for example, because this is representing sitting, there are many different parts, many different organs or movement organs that are out of play. And when you want to bring a muscular or a group of elastic structures into action at first, well, they don't respond. They don't respond very well. They have very little force, and you need to retrain. And this retraining is sensorially very difficult. It's a kind of movement that feel like impossible, and um, and it's also very tiring because many other structures want to that have been working too much. As soon as you want to bring into action parts that have been out of play, the parts that have been out of play don't respond, but the part that have been working too much respond immediately. And you have to combine inhibition. You want to inhibit the habitual mechanical response of different tissues, and you have to promote, in fact, movements that are very, very far from uh, your your usual way. So it's lessons can be very, very tiring. At first, with beginners, you have to be very nice and do not expect too much. What is interesting here is that the pupil, out of a reason system of teaching, will be able to not, well, affect any perfection, but start by himself or by herself, consider whether he's going in the right or the wrong direction. The right direction is if you find that after performing the readjustment of the structure. You're closer to the model. You're in the right direction. If you find that you perform the gesture, it feels fine and right, but in fact, the discrepancy between what the geometry you've achieved and the geometry you wanted has increased, then you're in the wrong direction. And that is fundamental. It's just to tell you where you are. Because when you know where you are, you can start going somewhere. The main problem of the somatic systems is that if you trust to someone to tell you where is the right, well, the right you're going to follow has no reason basis for you. I think that explains why the first generation teacher strayed away from Alexander's understanding of the expansion of the torso so fast, how it was lost in less than 10 years, the meaning of lengthening and widening, the meaning of uh, this new organization of the movement of the different parts of the mechanism of the torso was lost. And that is because they were not reasoning out what was the model that Alexander was following. They just had been shaped and they felt what was the correct organization. But that feeling is absolutely untrustworthy. So it was lost. Now, it's interesting to follow on this, and many students or teachers that have followed our different um, discussions, I've had questions about what it is we call differential speed of the movements of the parts. It's something that is troubling people. So I wanted to expand on communication with reason with an example that Alexander is proposing, and I will tell you why I think he was right and why I use the same way of presenting the different movements of the part of the torso. So we see here a passage from Man's Supreme Inheritance, and it's a passage where he expands on the idea of conscious control. He says, we find no better instance of the necessity for the application of the principle of conscious control to this fundamental and essential proposition of standing, walking, and running than in the photographs taken of Dorando as he appeared when he was making his last terrible efforts to reach the tape at the Olympic game in 1908. So this is Dorando. You see Dorando here. Is Pietro Dorando. He first won the Olympics marathon, and then he was disqualified. He was disqualified because he was carried over by people that were helping him. He was desperately tired, and he could not organize the movements of the different parts in order to reach the tape. That's we see the tape here. So it's quite interesting. Alexander is taking a photograph, a still photograph of a person that is supposed to be running with help. Okay. And I found that, yes, it's a very good idea to use at first example involving locomotion. Because when you involve just chair work, sitting to standing or sitting or standing, most people have much difficulty understanding that we are talking about assuming a position. So here is assuming a position of mechanical disadvantage. That's what Alexander is going to explain. And is assuming that position of mechanical disadvantage, of course, with the different parts of the torso relatively to the pivot, relatively to the point of contact with the floor. So at the moment the photo is taken, Alexander makes very clear that Pietro Dorando, was in fact using subconscious control, what he calls subconscious, and he adds subjective control. He's controlling his movement according to his subjective impression of what he is doing. I have other pictures of Dorando running. He's a very, very fine runner. His running style is really, really nice, according to this model of expansion of the torso. This is very different because he's desperately tired. He's made too much effort, and now he cannot. He is just basing everything on what he feels in order to reach the goal and finish the run. Um, so what Alexander is saying here, his analysis is that he says his body, as we see in these photographs, is thrown back from the hips. I want to make just a point. Very often, when Alexander used the term body, it's not in the sense that we use nowadays. Nowadays, the body is the whole self. When Alexander used the term body, he used the term body as would an horse trainer. For horse trainer, the body is the torso, the mechanism is the torso. And we see that in this case, it's absolutely true. His body, you could replace it, his torso, as we see him in this photograph, is thrown back from the hips, his arm outstretched behind him. That is incorrect. His arms are not outstretched behind, they are forward. But Alexander used exactly that photograph. I don't understand why he makes that mistake. He must be, in fact, writing from memory, and his memory is not accurate. But what is right is that, of course, the torso is thrown back from the hips, and his legs are bent forward at the knees. So this man is running very low, and he's running with the major mass of the structure thrown back from the point of contact with the floor. And Alexander is right to say that as a consequence, he's compelled to use almost all his physical force in order to save himself from falling backwards. He's struggling against a tremendous gravitational pull, which is dragging him away from his goal. Yes? So I've shown just next to it the picture I presented about a teacher in a walking experiment. And without knowing it, that teacher is walking, and we see, well, exactly the same subconscious effect that the person thinks that she feels that she's walking tall, that she's walking with ease, that he's walking with a quality of movement, but it's all an impression. And when you watch, what you see is that, of course, once again, the torso is backward relative to the pivot of the support from the floor. And so, in the same way, the person, without knowing it, is organizing the movements of the different part in such a way that the activity, the overall activity, is fighting gravity. This can be changed. That is the main point. Yeah, I'm not pointing the fingers. I was exactly the same before starting to reason. And so Alexander associates the guidance, the subjective control, and the subconscious guidance with being out of communication with his reason. So I wanted to explore this. I said, well, yes, it is possible to reason out what is happening. So I have made some diagrams using exactly the same parts in each, but I have organized the movements of the diagram differently in the two different diagrams. In the first one, it's very clear. Well, we have a locomotion, we have a progression forward, and we see that the speed of the top of the torso is much less than the speed of of course, the front of the lower part of the torso. This is not reason. The person is just trying to reach the tape. Yes, but we can reason out how this is organized. And we see that there is a particular shape with the upper torso very far backward. I'm coming back to this idea of the absence of ump here when there is ump there. Historically, it's very interesting to know that Delsart, who is in sort of way responsible for the harmonic expansion idea of the torso, had voice problems. It all started with the fact that he lost his voice in fact training for singing according to the way it was taught at the time. And he said he was able to, in fact, solve his voice problem using the harmonic expansion of the torso. So there is a relationship between having the upper torso forward and having the voice mechanism work better. And Alexander, we know, tells the same story. I think he's not lying again. I think he also had vocal problems, and he also found a way to solve his problem. And we see in his pictures that he solved this problem by organizing the different parts of the mechanism of the torso so that the connection between the lungs, the voice box, and the throat and the mouth was completely changed according to the harmonic expansion of the torso. So what do we see here? We see a reason analysis. We see that when I should have placed the image of the fantastic Dorando runner, because here we are presenting Dorando as a very, very poor runner. He was not. He was a magnificent runner when he was, in fact, in capacity. And when he was in capacity, we can see that the different parts of the mechanism of the torso have been moved according to a reason plan. And the reason plan is, once again, well, this plane of unity that Delsart presents. So we here are starting to see that it's possible from the start where we are out of communication with reason. We just move the different parts of the torso as it comes. We just sit the way we know. We just rest in the only way we can, which is our habit. But it's also possible to imagine using reason to start, in fact, piloting, ordering movements. I'm not saying it's going to be easy and fast, but I'm saying that you can monitor your progress with conscious guidance and control, and you can, well, in fact, more and more obtain a new organization, which is going to be, well, a way to improve the general functioning of the system. I am not presenting the improvement of the general functioning first, like saying, well, look, we have a fantastic system that will cure all, cure everything, that will make you dynamic, that will make you more capable of reasoning. No, I think it's already interesting enough to imagine taking control of a series of movement in order to present a new organization. The question is that possible or not? So this was necessary to, in fact, focus on our intent. What is the intent? The intent is not to, in fact, receive from someone else the correct way. The intent we have is different. The intent is to say, it's possible to start making experiments. Experiments where you are going to see whether you can translate verbal orders into concerted activity. Whether it's possible to change what we call a coordination of different movements at the same time. At first, it's just a process of inquiry that we are teaching. I do not teach the correct way. I teach people how to start inquiring by themselves. They only need for that to have a camera and a willingness to feel wrong. If they have that, well, that's fine. We can start exploring a lot. And the first exploration, of course, is regarding how we organize the movements of the different parts of the torso using reason. Do you think it's clear?
Yes, I think
Yes,
that
good.
conscious guidance and control, one of the biggest things we have to learn doing the technique is learning to feel wrong.
Yes, yes. And that's why it's so important to come back to the start of our conversation. And you asked me, why is it that we cannot trust our sensory appreciation? And so the the answer I gave is that we cannot trust our sensory appreciation because there are too many movements involved at the same time, and we cannot feel these different movements.
So
We can
on that
feel,
point, it's
yeah,
clear from the models, the images that you've shown us, that you're comparing the distances and the relations between different parts at all times. So that shows why you need to reason. You can't use your feeling to think in relations. You have to use reason to think in relations between different parts.
yes, that's one reason, but there is another one also that is involved. When you've seen a model, a very simple model of the different parts in space and time, um, you have to understand that very often we need to create an adjustment between a physical part, that is a bone, so something we don't feel. We don't feel bones as such. We'll feel the tension in the tissues, we'll feel the pressure, but we don't feel spots. Okay? But more than that, it's always to, in fact, relate a spot to another one that is very far away according to a geometrical uh, representation. You think, I want, when I, for example, when I make a step forward, I want that when I am recorded, if I extract the frame at the moment where the foot is going to contact with the floor, I want to see a vertical plane between, well, for example, the front of the ankle and the top of the torso. This is absolutely not possible with feelings. You cannot create a plane, a geometrical plane with feelings. You cannot relate spots relatively to a plane with feelings, and you can even less calculate speeds of different movements relative to a plane with feelings. So when we say conscious guidance is not feelings. You cannot feel a distance to an imaginary plane. You have no feeling receptors for that. It's another world. It's the world of the mind, and not the world, and not the lower mind of feeling. So this is another reason why being in communication with reason is so important. And so being in communication is reason is inversely proportional to how much you feel. If you, for example, when you do an experiment, we all went to the same thing, is that at one moment when the numbers of elements is growing, Alexander says you have to direct something like 12 elements at the same time and converging to the same conclusion. Well, I can tell you something, is that before being able to direct 12 spots at the same time, it takes time. Because at first, as soon as you've got 3 or 4, if you add a fifth, on top of the 4 that you're able to control, suddenly you discover that you lose everything, that you're back into your feeling world, that you're trying to do it, but you're back into the same soup of impressions and feelings, and wow, you need to restart. Learning conscious guidance and control is not like a progressive, constant progression towards something better and better. No, very often you discover that the mental tool you've been using before, well, helped you to get out of your morass of feeling and somatic training. Yes, but suddenly they are barring your way. Suddenly you have to get rid of them in order to get to a new stage. And so you need to use your mind to curb your, I don't know, your wanting to make results, your desire to make that nice progression. No. There is a lot of destruction involved in learning conscious guidance and control. And so it's a very interesting journey. It's I don't know very many other activities where you can encounter such exploration, because in modern times, well, everything has been more or less explored. No, that is not correct. The statement is absolutely wrong. I can tell you something that you have not explored is how you can somehow start to be in communication with reason to solve out a very intricate problem of coordination of movements. Yeah.
Okay, fantastic, Jeando.
Good.
So
I hope I am not. I hope people will read and hear these talks and see the interest and see the incentive of exploring. I hope it's not too frightening. It's not frightening. It's quite funny, in fact, to see oneself somehow being blocked by what would be described as quite a simple experiment, a simple problem to solve. No. We are blocked, fine. We have to recon with what is there, and we have to find solutions. And the solutions are not found by the teacher. The solutions are found by the pupil exploring. Yeah.
Yeah. Excellent. Okay. Well, we'll finish there and we'll talk again next week, Jeando.
Yes,
For
thank you.
people watching the video, check out the show notes underneath. You'll get links to Jeando's websites, and we'll see you again next week.
Thank you, Kevin.
Thank you, Jeando.
And
Bye-bye.
bye all.